Logan stood in the corridor holding a cardboard box and watched three men in expensive suits step through the glass entrance of the main conference room. Each carried a sleek laptop and a thick portfolio. He knew every one of them, not because they had been competitors, but because he had trained them himself. Every first instruction, every emergency response procedure, every system design they now carried into the room had come from him. CEO Evelyn had just approved salaries of $200,000 a year for each of them. What she didn't realize was that the employee she had dismissed 9 days earlier for $80,000 a year was the person who had built their expertise in the first place. They had replaced him with the very people he had mentored. But what happens when the system they depend on begins to fail? That morning had started like almost every other morning in Logan's life. His alarm rang at 5:45 a.m., and by 5:50 he was already in the kitchen preparing Grace's lunch. A peanut butter sandwich, an apple sliced into quarters, and 3 crackers arranged in a triangle because years ago Grace had told him triangles were her favorite shape, and he had never stopped doing it. Grace was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes, her father's determination, and a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit that accompanied her everywhere. She shuffled into the kitchen with messy hair, dragging Biscuit by one ear, and climbed onto the bar stool with the same enthusiastic lack of grace she always displayed, throwing her entire small frame into the effort. "Daddy," she asked, "are you going to get yelled at today?" Logan finished wrapping the sandwich. "No one yells at me at work, Grace. Tommy's dad gets yelled at. He says his boss has a really loud voice." "My boss doesn't yell." He turned and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Mostly she sends emails." Grace considered that carefully, as children often do when deciding whether emails are more frightening than yelling. She ate her cereal. Logan put on his jacket, the same gray technical jacket he wore every day. The right cuff was slightly frayed after 3 years of rubbing against desk edges. When Grace stretched out her feet, he tied her shoes, and at 6:30 they left together, her hand in his and Biscuit tucked under her other arm. Anyone seeing Logan in that worn jacket, those scuffed work shoes, and accompanied by a little girl would never have guessed much about him. That wasn't accidental. It was a decision he had made 3 years earlier and never reversed. Nexora Systems occupied 12 floors of a tower in the financial district and employed nearly 1,400 people. The company built and maintained enterprise data infrastructure, the invisible framework that kept countless businesses functioning in real time. Its flagship platform was NextCore Grid, a distributed data routing network serving 47 major corporate clients simultaneously. It managed transaction streams, operational databases, and time-sensitive communications across multiple industries. Without NextCore Grid, banks couldn't complete overnight settlements on time. A logistics company in Dallas couldn't monitor its fleet. A regional hospital network on the East Coast couldn't transfer patient records quickly enough to be useful. NextCore Grid wasn't exciting. It was necessary. It was the kind of system nobody noticed until it failed, and then it became the only thing anyone cared about. Logan's official position was Senior Maintenance Technician. He had personally requested that title 3 years ago when he stepped down from his previous role. The paperwork had been approved without question because almost nobody voluntarily moved down the corporate ladder, and no process existed for asking why someone would choose to. Before that request, before the quiet demotion, Logan had been Nexora's principal systems architect. He had designed NextCore Grid from its earliest specifications. He had spent 14 months writing the routing engine by hand, testing edge cases late into the night on a used workstation in a spare room, while Grace was still too young to stay awake long enough to see him finish. He had created ThermalSync, a thermal management subsystem designed specifically for the unusual combination of heat and load fluctuations inside Nexora's server environment. He trained the maintenance teams. He wrote the documentation. He conducted architecture reviews. For 4 years, he was the single individual most responsible for the system that made Nexora valuable. Then his wife died. He rarely spoke about it. He informed HR that he needed a lower stress role for personal reasons. HR provided forms. Logan signed them. The following Monday he arrived as a maintenance technician. Then he came back the Monday after that. And the one after that. Eventually, it simply became who he was in the building. Truthfully, he liked it. The work was straightforward. Something broke. He repaired it. Something required inspection. He inspected it. No endless strategy meetings. No presentations about market positioning. No debates over branding language. He fixed things. He went home. He cooked dinner. He read bedtime stories to Grace. He slept without replaying architectural decisions in his head at 2 in the morning. It wasn't prestigious, but it gave him his daughter back. And she was the only investment that had ever produced a return he truly cared about. Every morning, Logan walked through the server corridor on his way to his workstation. Every morning, he paused briefly beside the primary rack assembly. Not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to listen. From sound alone, and from tiny shifts in airflow, he could tell whether the system was healthy. He knew its rhythms the way people know the sounds their own house makes at night. He knew which fans became louder under heavy load. He knew the faint clicking sound Node 7 produced whenever ambient temperatures in that quadrant exceeded 92 degrees. He knew countless things that existed nowhere in documentation. Some had never been written down. Others had been documented so poorly that nobody knew where to find them. He also knew about Dominic. Dominic was Nexora's chief operating officer. 45 years old. The kind of man who wore authority the way some people wore luxury watches, expensively, and with constant awareness of who was looking. During his 8 years at Nexora, Dominic had developed a talent for identifying employees whose knowledge could become inconvenient. Logan fit that category. Not because he was looking for secrets. Because during a routine infrastructure audit, he had once opened a directory he assumed was irrelevant and discovered encrypted correspondence between Dominic and an outside firm with no publicly known relationship to Nexora. He never opened the files. He simply noted the directory path and moved on. It wasn't his concern. He wasn't searching for trouble. But he remembered it, just as he remembered everything else. Quietly, accurately, permanently. Dominic didn't know exactly what Logan had seen. But Dominic understood risk. And Logan represented a kind of risk he could not tolerate. A man with deep system access, a near-perfect memory, and no particular loyalty to anyone's secrets. When the board appointed Evelyn as the new CEO 6 weeks earlier, Dominic immediately recognized an opportunity. A new CEO arrived without a map. She needed guidance. Dominic excelled at providing guidance. Evelyn had spent 9 years at a strategic consulting firm, helping large corporations operate more efficiently. At 35, she was intelligent, disciplined, and exceptionally analytical. She read financial models the way avid readers consumed novels, quickly, and with an instinct for hidden implications. What she lacked was familiarity with the people beneath the organizational chart. Her understanding came from reports, presentations, and the interpretations of others. Dominic was the most polished presenter she encountered. His reports were clean. His logic flowed smoothly. His recommendations always appeared to be supported by evidence. The workforce optimization presentation he prepared contained 42 slides. It included productivity metrics, compensation benchmarks, and a section called Strategic Capability Gaps. Within it, Dominic built a careful argument for replacing the current maintenance operation with an external specialist team. He highlighted Carter's experience at Google, Adrian's MIT education, Isaac's years at Amazon Web Services. Their combined salary costs were presented as investments in future capability rather than replacement expenses. What Dominic did not mention was that all three had learned the foundations of distributed systems architecture through Nexora's internal training program. He also neglected to mention who had created and taught that program. Evelyn approved the proposal in 15 minutes. She asked 3 financial questions. She received 3 concise answers. Then she signed the authorization and moved on. Nobody asked who actually kept the system running every day. Nobody even thought to ask. Logan was eating a sandwich in the server room when HR located him. It was Wednesday, shortly after noon. Grace's school had released students early, so he had picked her up instead of arranging emergency childcare, something he occasionally did when schedules changed unexpectedly. Grace sat quietly on his jacket beside Biscuit, drawing in a notebook. The server room hummed steadily. She had spent enough time there to know the rules: touch nothing and speak softly. She was whispering a story to Biscuit when Sandra from HR entered. Sandra looked like someone assigned a task she disliked and wanted to finish quickly. She handed Logan a white envelope. Her words sounded rehearsed. Position eliminated, organizational restructuring, effective end of week, 3-month severance, access credentials revoked. Logan placed his sandwich down. He turned the envelope over once. "Who's handling the phase drift issue on Node 7? He asked. Sandra blinked. "I'm sorry. Node 7. Under summer conditions, there's a thermal behavior that can trigger cascading failures. Has the incoming team been briefed on it?" Sandra's expression made it obvious she had never heard of Node 7, thermal behavior, or phase drift. "The incoming team has received full access to all system documentation," she replied carefully. Logan nodded. He slipped the envelope into his pocket. Then he returned to the terminal and completed the routing correction he had been working on before she arrived. A minor issue that wouldn't cause problems immediately, but eventually would if ignored. He finished the repair, verified the results, saved the logs, then stood up. "Thank you, Sandra." He folded his jacket over one arm, handed Grace her notebook and crayons. She picked up Biscuit. Together they walked out. Crossing the main floor, they passed the conference room where Dominic was introducing the 3 new specialists. Several employees had gathered to watch. Someone applauded. Carter noticed Logan first. Recognition crossed his face. Then something more complicated. He began lifting a hand in greeting. Dominic subtly stepped between them, redirecting attention back to the room. The moment disappeared. From the staircase overlooking the floor, Evelyn watched the introduction with satisfaction. Then she noticed a man carrying a cardboard box walking toward the lobby. A little girl walked beside him, holding a stuffed rabbit. The man showed no urgency. That briefly struck her as unusual. Then she returned to her conversation. At the front desk, security guard Marcus immediately saw Logan approaching. Marcus had worked mornings for 5 years and knew nearly every employee by name. He came around the desk and held the door open. "Mr. Logan." Thank you, Marcus. Of course. Marcus asked no questions. 5 years had taught him when not to. Outside, Grace tugged his hand. Daddy, those men with the nice jackets, did you know them? Yes. How? I taught them. Grace thought about that. So they're your students? They were. She considered that too. Are they smarter than you now? Logan paused. Not because he was unsure. Because he wanted to answer honestly. They know a lot, he said. They're very good. Grace nodded. Then swung his hand. Can we get ice cream? Yes. We can get ice cream. He never looked back at the building. That night, after Grace fell asleep with biscuit under her chin, Logan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He wasn't searching for work. Before reaching home, he had already received messages from former colleagues. Expertise travels quickly through professional networks. He would review those opportunities tomorrow. Tonight he focused on something else. For months, he had been writing a complete operational guide for NextCore Grid. Not an executive summary. Not a polished internal wiki. A real survival manual. A document intended for the person alone at 3 in the morning, trying to keep the system alive. Failure procedures. Rare edge cases. Manual override instructions. Recovery protocols. At its center sat a detailed section on thermal sync, the subsystem he created but never fully documented internally. For 2 hours he wrote carefully. Eventually he added another entry. Node 7 phase drift activation conditions. Combined ambient temperature and load exceeding 94% capacity, most common during July and August. Thermal sync state memory must never be reset during remediation. If state memory is lost, execute complete reinitialization sequence. He documented the entire sequence, then saved the file to his personal drive. He did not send it to anyone at Nexora. After staring at the screen for a moment, he closed the laptop, switched off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The following Monday, Carter, Adrian, and Isaac presented their modernization roadmap to Evelyn and Dominic. The proposal was genuinely impressive. An 18-month plan. Reduced cloud expenses. Expanded capacity. Improved infrastructure efficiency. The presentation was polished. The answers were confident. Evelyn listened attentively and asked difficult questions. The team handled them well. Later, Carter opened the original NextCore Grid architecture files. He wanted to understand the foundation before modifying it. The documentation was dense, unconventional, structured around principles rather than industry standards. Handwritten notes covered diagrams. After a few minutes, he closed the file. Old school design, he told Adrian. We'll need to reorganize the documentation before we build on top of it. Adrian agreed. They moved on. The first 2 weeks went smoothly. Carter removed 3 seemingly redundant monitoring processes. Adrian improved database indexing efficiency. Isaac optimized routing logic across several secondary nodes. Progress reports showed measurable gains. Evelyn was pleased. Dominic even more so. What none of them realized was that one of the processes Carter eliminated wasn't redundant at all. It was the secondary verification system, thermal sync, used to validate its state memory before engaging thermal compensation. From the outside, it looked like duplicate logging. Removing it was a reasonable decision, based on everything Carter knew. The problem was that Carter didn't know about thermal sync. And thermal sync was what prevented Node 7 from drifting under extreme summer temperatures. And it was now the first week of August. The failure occurred on a Wednesday. The same weekday Logan had received his termination letter, though nobody noticed the coincidence. Outside temperatures reached 96 degrees by late afternoon and remained above 88 through midnight. It was the fourth straight day of a historic heat wave. Inside Nexora's facility, cooling systems operated at maximum capacity. The Node 7 quadrant maintained an ambient temperature of 93.2 degrees. Close to the threshold. Dangerously close. At 11:47 p.m., irregularities appeared. Minor latency spikes. Automated monitoring classified them as moderate priority alerts. At 11:52, the spikes became cascading errors. Without its validation process, thermal sync entered a failure loop. At 12:03 a.m., NextCore Grid's primary routing layer went offline. 47 enterprise clients lost connectivity simultaneously. Dominic called Evelyn at 12:05. She was still working from her home office. "How long?" she asked immediately. "We don't know. Get Carter's team in here, now." All three arrived by 12:15, phones still warm from the calls that had pulled them from sleep. The server room looked the same as always. The lighting hadn't changed. The equipment hadn't changed. But every experienced engineer recognized the atmosphere instantly. The atmosphere of a system that had stopped cooperating. At 12:22, Carter made his first diagnosis. Load balancer failure on Node 7. The first solution they attempted was a restart. Node 7 was rebooted. The system never recovered. Adrian stepped in next. His diagnosis pointed to a database replication conflict. The restart had created a synchronization mismatch between several nodes. He proposed restoring from a backup snapshot taken 6 hours earlier. The rollback process consumed 22 minutes. At 12:57 a.m., the network returned. It remained operational for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then it crashed again. This time the failure spread farther, pulling 3 more nodes down with it. Isaac handled the third recovery effort. After reviewing the logs, he concluded that the routing tables weren't damaged by the original outage. The corruption had come from the failed rollback, which had distributed incomplete state information throughout the network. He began rebuilding the routing tables manually. That effort lasted 47 minutes. At 2:13 a.m., the system came online once more. It survived 9 minutes. Then everything failed. Every primary node in NextCore Grid went dark. The emergency failover systems, built to manage short interruptions, had never been designed for a cascading collapse of this magnitude. They continued operating for 6 minutes. Then they fell silent too. Evelyn stood near the corner of the server room wearing the same outfit she'd had on when Dominic called her: slacks, a dark blouse, and shoes she hadn't bothered changing. A paper cup sat in her hand. Marcus at reception had given it to her more than an hour earlier. The coffee inside was completely cold. She watched Carter sitting motionless at a terminal, hands hovering above the keyboard. She watched Adrian repeat the same diagnostic sequence for the 5th time. She watched Isaac stare at the routing logs with a look she had never seen before on someone usually so confident. She couldn't name the expression, but she understood what it meant. It was the look of someone who had reached the edge of their expertise and found nothing beyond it. Her eyes shifted toward Dominic. He stood beside the doorway with folded arms. He wasn't looking at any of the screens. He was staring at the floor. His face appeared strangely gray beneath the fluorescent lighting. "Find a solution," Evelyn said. "Now." At 2:17 in the morning, Carter remained alone in front of the terminal. Adrian had stepped into the hallway to make calls. Isaac was reviewing technical documents on his laptop. Carter was doing neither. He sat staring at the monitor. The problem had stopped feeling technical. It had become something else. He thought about the architecture file he had opened and dismissed after only 2 minutes 3 weeks earlier. He remembered the unusual diagrams covered in handwritten notes. He remembered a training session from 4 years ago. Back then he had been 25 years old and newly hired as a junior engineer at Nexora. A man in a plain gray jacket had stood before a whiteboard explaining thermal state drift in distributed systems and why serious infrastructure had to account for it from the very beginning. Carter reached for his phone. He scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in 2 years. The call rang 3 times. "You already know, don't you?" Carter said when the line connected. It wasn't really a question. "When I handed the system over, I left a condition unresolved in Node 7, Logan replied calmly. "There was no intention behind it. I planned to come back and address it later. I never did. That's my fault." Carter remained silent. Nearby, a monitoring display cycled through another page of red warnings before repeating itself again. "Can you help?" he finally asked. "I need to speak with your CEO." Carter stood immediately. Covering the phone with his hand, he stepped into the hallway and found Evelyn. "There's someone you need to talk to." Logan arrived at 2:38 a.m. He wore a gray t-shirt and dark pants and carried nothing. Grace was staying upstairs with Dorothy, a retired school teacher who lived 1 floor above him and had watched Grace before whenever emergencies happened. When Logan knocked on her door at 2:15, Dorothy had simply told him to go handle what needed handling. The taxi ride had taken 11 minutes. Marcus was working the front desk. 2 nights each week he covered the midnight shift, and tonight happened to be one of them. "Mr. Logan," Marcus said. He buzzed him through immediately. No additional questions. Evelyn waited outside the server room. The cold coffee was gone. Her arms rested at her sides. She studied Logan the same way she evaluated any unfamiliar variable, directly, carefully, trying to determine exactly what she was dealing with. "You're the maintenance technician." "I was," Logan replied. Carter looked between them. "He designed the system." "Yes." For several seconds, Evelyn simply stared at him. Her expression wasn't quite guilt. It wasn't quite blame either. It looked more like the realization that the map she'd been given was missing half the terrain. "You trained all 3 of them." Logan didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the server room. "We can discuss that after the system is running." He looked back at her. "Do we still have 4 hours before the SLA penalties activate on the primary contracts?" Evelyn blinked. "The threshold is 5.5 hours after initial failure. We're currently at 2 hours and 35 minutes. "Then we still have time," Logan said. "But not much." He pushed open the door and entered. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac all turned toward him. No one spoke. Logan looked at each of them briefly. There was no anger in his expression. No satisfaction. He wasn't performing emotion. His attention was already on the problem. He sat at the central terminal and pulled the keyboard toward him. "Here's what happened." He wasn't addressing Evelyn. He wasn't addressing Dominic. He was speaking to Carter, Adrian, and Isaac, because they were the ones who would eventually have to maintain this system. Next core grid includes a thermal management subsystem I built called Thermal Sync. It controls Node 7's phase behavior whenever ambient temperatures and network load exceed specific thresholds simultaneously. Above 92 degrees. Above 94% load. When both conditions occur together, thermal sync enters a compensation state that prevents a cascade. He typed several commands. A hidden directory appeared. None of the three engineers had ever seen it before. Buried 4 levels beneath the standard architecture folders sat a strangely named directory that looked meaningless unless you already knew what it contained. Thermal sync stores state memory, Logan continued. That memory tracks where the system currently exists within the compensation cycle. If that memory gets reset during a restart, for example, the subsystem loses position and enters an error cycle instead of a recovery cycle. He pointed at the screen. That's what triggered the original failure. He paused. The secondary validation process that protected that state memory was removed 3 weeks ago. It appeared to be duplicate logging. It wasn't. The room became very still. Adrian closed his eyes. Isaac looked down. I'm not assigning blame. Logan's tone remained completely neutral. And I mean that. The thermal sync documentation was incomplete. That's my responsibility. I should have finished it before leaving. He turned back to the terminal. The rollback worsened the situation because the snapshot didn't contain thermal sync state information. The system restarted in the middle of an active thermal event, as if it were starting from zero. Then the routing table rebuild introduced another layer of incomplete state data. Right now, the network believes it's operating in 3 different modes simultaneously. He resumed typing. There's only one way out of this. We manually reinitialize thermal sync using the correct sequence. Then we perform a staged restart that respects thermal compensation timing. His fingers continued moving. The timing depends on current hardware conditions. This isn't a fixed procedure. You read the environment and adjust accordingly. For several minutes he worked silently. Carter stood behind him, watching every command. None appeared in any documentation. None had ever been covered during training. They belonged entirely to thermal sync. Entirely to Next Core Grid. Entirely to the person who built both. The interval between stages 3 and 4 needs to be longer tonight, Logan said. The temperature is still above 90 degrees. If we rush it, state reassertion won't stabilize. We'll wait 6 minutes. At 3:17 a.m., Node 7 returned. And stayed up. At 3:29, the primary routing layer reconnected. At 3:44, Next Core Grid was fully operational. All 47 clients were restored. The room became quiet. Not empty quiet. The specific silence that follows the end of a long, difficult struggle. Carter leaned against a rack. Adrian released a slow breath. Isaac sat in a chair near the wall and tipped his head back. Logan performed one final verification. Not because he doubted the system. Because he simply wasn't capable of walking away from critical infrastructure without confirming it personally. The results came back clean. He saved the logs and pushed the keyboard away. Evelyn had barely moved throughout the entire process. She hadn't checked her phone, hadn't interrupted, hadn't asked questions. She had simply watched. At some point, Dominic had left the room. Logan noticed and moved on. Where is the documentation you mentioned? Evelyn asked. The thermal sync guide. It isn't in Nexora systems, Logan said. I've been building a complete version on my personal drive. It's not finished yet. Can you share it? I'll finish it first. Evelyn studied him. The look on her face belonged to someone realizing that the framework they had been using to understand a situation had been fundamentally incorrect. It wasn't comfortable, but it was genuine. and Logan trusted honesty more than comfort. Eventually Carter, Adrian, and Isaac left to get coffee. When the door closed, only the steady hum of servers remained. The same sound Logan had listened to every morning for years. The sound that told him everything was functioning as it should. Evelyn sat in Adrian's empty chair. "I want to understand something," she said. "When HR terminated you, why didn't you explain any of this? The system. Thermal sink. Your role." Logan considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. Because the decision had already been made using a document that described me as a maintenance technician. Nothing I said in that hallway would have changed how you interpreted the situation. You would have needed context. And context takes longer than a hallway conversation. You could have requested a meeting. I could have. He nodded. But when I asked HR who would handle the Node 7 issue after I left, they didn't know what I was talking about. That told me everything I needed to know. Evelyn looked at the terminal. "You left some documentation." "Partially. Not enough." "That's on me too." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. The kind of silence that comes when two people are looking directly at the truth. Without looking away.